In the pursuit of learning to make felted art pieces, I bought this book, Art in Felt and Stitch by Moy Mackay. It showcases some of Mackay's gorgeous work, which combines wet felting with needle felting and embroidery, as well as providing information on how she creates her pieces. Mackay makes a variety of art, from landscapes to floral pieces to still life, all made with wool and other fibres. It also includes 4 tutorials instructing you on how to make some of these pieces for yourself. It's such an inspiring book, and I definitely recommend checking it out if you're interested. I decided to try this tutorial for a slightly abstract patchwork landscape. I say try. Mackay lays out the exact steps to get a result as close as possible to her own pieces, but I took a much more interpretive approach. So I'd say I more took inspiration from the tutorial than I did actually follow it. I started by cutting a piece of plain pre-felt to use as backing. Already I'm diverging from the tutorial. I thought this sounded easier than laying out multiple layers of loose roving, so I thought I'd give it a go. Then I set myself up on the floor with all the wools I wanted to use laid out around me, and began to assemble different colours as instructed. First, we lay out the squares of wool for the sky, varying the size of the pieces and the direction of the fibres. I decided mine would be a night sky, all dark, moody blues and purples. I tried to do a bit of a subtle gradient, with darker colours at the top and lighter colours closer to the horizon, as if night is just falling. Mackay's piece includes a sun, so I added a moon in its place. Next, it's time to add the patchwork fields in a range of greens, yellows and browns, using the same technique as for the sky. Now I'm laying some long strips of wool for tree trunks and cutting small bits for foliage. My trees weren't particularly successful, I don't think. They ended up much bigger and more spread out than Mackay's, covering too much sky and moon for my preference, and they also didn't contrast well against the dark sky. Then we add in some extra detail to the field using little scraps of wool, wool neps and some silk, with the intention being to add the impression of flowers and crops. Again, I don't feel it turned out too well in my case, but we persevere nonetheless. In Mackay's example, the central feature of the piece is a chapel, but I felt more inspired to make a little cottage in my picture instead. I think that's the wonderful thing about making things yourself. Even when following a tutorial or a pattern or a recipe, you're always free to make whatever changes you like so the end result suits your preferences. I cut the main shape of the building out of pre-felt and used layered wool roving for the roof. Smaller pieces of the same black wool are used to make the door. The final step before wet felting is adding in a wispy cloud using some silk. Wet felting involves wetting, warming and agitating the wool fibres so that they latch onto one another and bind into one piece of fabric. I'm using an old milk bottle with holes pierced in the lid to wet felt this piece. I filled it with warm soapy water so I can sprinkle it all over the picture. Here I diverged from the instructions out of necessity, as I didn't have the equipment Mackay suggested using. So I'm starting by covering the piece with bubble wrap for protection, then gently patting the wool down and rubbing it carefully to try not to move anything out of place. Then once it's kind of like loosely felted, I rolled it up in the bubble wrap and rolled it back and forth like a rolling pin to felt it more thoroughly, following a tutorial I found here on YouTube, which I'll link in the description below. It teaches a great beginner-friendly method that doesn't require you to buy any equipment to give wet felting a go. So if you're wondering why I laid this picture out on top of bubble wrap, that's why. Here's how it turned out after wet felting. Once the piece is dry, the next step is needle felting, in part to add some extra finer details like windows and shadows on the cottage, but also to fix some of the things that have moved during the wet felting process, and fill in any gaps that have been created. I ended up doing more needle felting than was called for because I realised my piece actually wasn't very securely felted together. In the end, I decided to wet felt it again just to make it a bit more solid. I also decided I didn't like the neps, and since they weren't very well felted on there anyway, I removed them. I also added some extra wool to the moon to define it more and carded a new colour for the yellow fields that was a little less bright and had a little more depth. Mackay's pieces are characterised not just by her use of felting, but also her use of machine embroidery. First, you need to attach an iron-on adhesive paper backing. Since I didn't have any and didn't want to wait while I ordered some, I used iron-on interfacing instead. I wasn't sure how my sewing machine would cope with doing free motion embroidery, since the friend who gave it to me did say that it's old and temperamental and probably needs servicing, but I gave it a go anyway. It did not like it. I don't know if it was having removed the presser foot as the book said to do, or having used interfacing instead of paper backing, or the looseness of the fabric even after wet felting it a second time, or a combination of all the above that it didn't like, but I ended up doing the machine embroidery by hand using thin sewing thread. Mackay recommends irregular stitching over neat straight lines, creating a looser, less precise style with more personality, so I tried to replicate that in my hand stitching, specifically trying not to follow the felted lines exactly as I made my outlines, and using stitches of different lengths to create some variation. It was great practice at letting go of perfectionism and instead embracing just creating, without nitpicking or getting too in my head about it. There was something very freeing about getting to create in such a playful, low-pressure way. At this point though, I was a little disappointed with how the piece was turning out. It felt a little plain, and I found the horizon line a little flat, and wished I'd added some hills instead of staying faithful to that part of the tutorial. But I'm learning that most pieces go through stages like this where we're not happy with them, so I persevered. The final step for this piece is hand embroidery. The tutorial here very much assumes you have followed it exactly, saying things like, use this stitch for the pink square in a matching thread, and outline the turquoise square like this with a contrasting thread. Of course, I didn't have a pink or a turquoise square, so I was very lax in my following of the tutorial here, using the techniques suggested but choosing the placement and colour for myself. Also, my grandma gave me a bunch of her craft things that she doesn't use anymore, including a travel sewing kit that included these tiny little scissors that I'm using here. And they're adorable, but also I have no idea why one blade is longer than the other. I'm kind of confused about it, to be honest, but if anyone can tell me why, I'd love to know. This bit was definitely the most fun bit of the whole project because it really started to come together at this point, and I was really able to let go and have fun with it. Again, Mackay advises to use big stitches and to not be too precise with it, giving a really quirky, playful, whimsical vibe that I just love. I also added a couple of things that weren't suggested. For one, I decided to try and give the tree foliage a bit more definition, using a dark thread to suggest shadows and a variety of greens to suggest light areas. I tried to give the impression of clumps of leaves like is shown in Mackay's original picture. I'm not sure how successful it really was, but I do think it was an improvement on how it looked before, so there's that. For another thing, I also added some stars in the sky, using some random little stitches, some crossed stitches, and some French knots. In the end, this turned out so cute. I love the little cottage and the moon and the stars and the little embroidered flowers. All the extra textures and dimension added by the hand embroidery made such a huge difference to the overall effect. There are some areas of stitching I'm not too happy with, like this bit here, which I think is a bit messy, but I'm still glad I gave these techniques a go, and I still love how the piece as a whole turned out. this piece took me at least 5 hours from start to finish, not including the quote-unquote machine embroidery, which may well have taken me another 3 or even 5 hours, or well, more to be honest. I'm terrible at estimating time, as I did it over several days. Laying out the wool took about an hour and 20 minutes. I probably spent about an hour needle felting, though if I'd wet felted it more thoroughly the first time, this number likely would have been much lower. The wet felting itself only takes, I'd guess, around 15 minutes, not including drying time, of course. As for the hand embroidery that was always meant to be done by hand, I did most of that in one morning. I'd guess it took me maybe 2, maybe 3 hours, but I think it was really worth all that time. What do you think? Would you have stuck exactly to Mackay's tutorial, or would you have followed your own path like I did? Let me know in the comments. As always, please like this video if you enjoyed it, please subscribe if you haven't already, and feel free to check out my other craft videos. And until next time, happy crafting!